Canada has something America desperately needs, and there is no easy way around it. Every step of the building process becomes more expensive because of this. In the end, owning a home becomes even harder in the United States. The National Association of Homebuilders has calculated that recent tariff actions on imported construction materials could add approximately $10,900 to the cost of constructing a typical new American single-family home. That figure covers the full range of tariff-affected building materials: lumber, steel, aluminum, copper, and other imported components. But Canadian softwood lumber is the single largest contributor to that cost increase because it supplies the overwhelming majority of the framing material that American residential construction depends on. Canadian lumber cannot be quickly replaced. American builders cannot opt out of the tariff. The $10,900 is a real cost that someone pays, and in almost every case, that someone is the homebuyer. The United States imported just over 11.8 billion board feet of softwood lumber from Canada in 2024. Canada accounts for roughly 85% of all U.S. softwood lumber imports and accounts for nearly a quarter of the available softwood lumber supply in the entire American market. These are not figures from a period before the trade dispute. They are the 2024 import numbers, representing the supply structure that American builders depend on right now. Under the current tariff regime, while paying elevated costs on every stick of framing lumber that crosses the border, the tariff structure applying to that Canadian lumber has been stacked in stages over the past 18 months. Before the current escalation, an effective, combined, countervailing and anti-dumping duty rate of 14.5% was already in place on Canadian softwood, the product of the long-running softwood lumber dispute that the Commerce Department has been administering since 2002. The Trump administration then imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian goods as part of its broader trade measures. On top of that, Trump ordered a national security probe into global lumber imports in early 2025, which produced the Section 232 proclamation, adding a further 10% national security tariff effective October 14, 2025. The NAHB estimated that the combined effect of the anti-dumping and countervailing duties, plus the additional 25% tariff on Canadian products, could push the overall effective rate on Canadian lumber well north of 50%. Even at the revised post-April 2026 preliminary determination rate, the effective combined burden sits at 34.83%, more than double the 14.5% that was in place before the current administration's tariff escalation began. Softwood lumber prices have already reflected that tariff stack. Framing lumber prices rose 12.7% since the end of 2024, as the tariff uncertainty alone began affecting purchasing decisions and supply chain planning. U.S. framing lumber prices then surged a further 30% off December 2025 lows, as the full combined tariff burden took effect and Q1 2026 import volumes fell 24% year over year to 6.2 million cubic meters. The price increase is not hypothetical. It is in the current quarter purchasing data of every American homebuilder who has bought framing lumber since the tariff escalation began. The NAHB's formal response to the tariff environment describes the advocacy posture of an organization that has been fighting this specific battle for years. On March 31st, 2025, NAHB filed a comment letter with the Department of Commerce arguing that housing is a critical component of national security and that no further lumber tariffs should be imposed under the Section 232 National Security Authority. On January 31st, NAHB sent a letter to the White House urging the president to exempt critical building materials from the proposed 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. On March 5th, Hughes met directly with USTR Greer. On February 11th, NAHB Chief Advocacy Officer Ken Wingert and Senior Federal Legislative Director Alex Strong met with Quebec Premier and Canadian officials at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. The U.S. needs Canadian lumber, Wingert told the Canadian officials, a statement that describes the operational reality of American home building, regardless of what tariff policy Washington implements. The building materials cost increase extends beyond lumber, which is important context for the $10,900 figure. Approximately 7.3% of all goods used in new residential construction originated from a foreign nation in 2024, meaning tariffs affect a specific and documented share of the total material input base. For American home building, 70% of gypsum imports the material that makes drywall come from Mexico. The United States imports nearly $500 million worth of gas ranges from Mexico annually. Steel, aluminum, copper, home appliances, and a range of other building materials are sourced internationally and face tariffs that compound with the lumber duties. Building materials overall have risen 34% since December 2020, far higher than the general rate of inflation, a baseline cost escalation that existed before the current tariff round and that the new tariffs are layering on top of. The housing starts data documents the consequence of those compounding cost pressures on actual construction activity. Full year 2025 single-family housing starts fell 7% to 943,000 units, the weakest annual result since the pandemic recovery. That 943,000 unit figure exists against a backdrop of a documented 4.5 million home shortage. The estimated gap between current housing stock and the number of units required to meet American household formation demand, a housing market already short. 4.5 million homes reduced its annual new construction pace by 7% in the first full year of the elevated tariff environment. The supply gap is growing, not shrinking. The uncertainty dimension of the tariff situation is the element that NAHB has consistently identified as compounding the direct material cost impact. Builders who cannot accurately predict their lumber costs, 90 days out cannot price their homes accurately, cannot commit to production volumes confidently, and cannot offer affordable housing options at price points that depend on material cost assumptions that may be obsolete by the time the house is framed. Some developers are delaying projects specifically because the material cost uncertainty makes project financial models unreliable. A project that pencils at one lumber price does not pencil at a lumber price 30% higher, and the decision about whether to break ground gets deferred until the cost environment stabilizes enough to commit. For years, NAHB has been leading the fight against tariffs because of their detrimental effect on housing affordability, the organization stated in its formal advocacy positioning ahead of the April 2025 tariff announcements. The phrase "for years" captures how long this specific organization has been documenting the same mechanism. Canadian lumber tariffs raise construction costs. Higher construction costs reduce housing affordability. Reduced affordability slows new supply, and slower supply compresses a housing market already failing to produce enough homes to meet demand. The Canadian lumber that crossed the US border at approximately $165 per cubic meter in Q1 2026, roughly half the cost of the next cheapest alternative sources, arrived in American framing yards at a tariff-elevated effective cost that transferred $10,900 per home into the price structure of every new single-family house an American builder broke ground on in 2025-2026. The builders did not choose to absorb that cost. The buyers absorbed it in higher home prices, reduced square footage, fewer amenity options, or deferred purchasing decisions. The houses that did not get built at all because the math stopped working do not show up in a cost per unit figure. They show up in the housing shortage data as units that should have been constructed and were not.